very typical of the way we run certain meetings, that when someone brings something for us to consider collectively, we usually invite that person to say a few words about it, why they've written it, or what they're hoping to do. And I think it really works to structure the conversation. So, George, if you're comfortable, I'll let you introduce yourself, to though it kind of already happened, I guess. But anyways, and please do say a few words about the book.
Oh, okay, I'm happy to do that. I only have one slide. I just tried to share my screen. Did it happen?
We've got Adam Smith, is that
Yes,
right?
good.
But we've also got
And
you.
you.
Sorry,
And
you can
so
see Adam Smith. Adam Smith now, yes?
that's it, yeah.
Okay, good. First of all, I was started writing this book several years ago, and I had the chance to spend some time with several of you on the screen, in fact, in Italy for a week or two, while I was just trying to really start to clarify my ideas about the harm that economists do as they aspire to do good. I should tell you that I came into the economics profession. I started my training in the mid to late 80s, and I was angry about economics. And here I am 50 years later, and I'm still angry about economics. But over time, I've gotten much clearer about what it is that makes me so angry. And what makes me so, this isn't the thing I wanted to show you, so let me just get rid of this. What makes me so angry about economics, I've just chosen one quotation to give you. This is a book. It's called Better Living Through Economics, that was published just a handful of years ago, 2010. John Siegfried edited the book. He was the executive secretary of the American Economic Association for, I don't know, 15 years. And as a consequence of that, he was around the leading lights in my profession. And he decides that the economics profession isn't given enough credit for all the good that it does. And he wants to write a book that shows us, chapter by chapter, how the economics profession has saved the world. And he was able, because of his position as the secretary treasurer, he's able to recruit the real leading lights in economics, some of the most important economists of the late 20th century, to write the chapters in the book. And so each chapter is on a different topic area. So for example, Anne Kruger, who was the chief economist at the World Bank, and she's been at the IMF and beyond, she writes the chapter on trade, and she spends 20 pages telling us that free trade essentially saved the global South. And what's interesting when you read the essays in the book is that they don't spend a lot of time, if at all, talking about the losers. That is to say, that's how we say in economics, the people who are harmed by economic interventions. And the reason the authors don't do this is because they've been forgiven by the editor, forgiven from having to deal with the downside. In the introduction to the book, the editor's introduction, he says something like this. Look, if a policy is consistent with Kaldor-Hicks, meaning if the gains to the winners are greater than the losses to the losers, then, he says, at least in theory, the policy change could be constructed to make some people better off without making no one worse off, while making no one worse off. Absent such considerations as envy and other relative income issues, the policy change might then be declared a good thing. Unfortunately, however, matters are not quite so simple. Whether in fact compensation actually must be paid, or whether it is sufficient that it could be paid, even though it's not paid, remains controversial. And then comes this sentence. The chapters in this volume, by and large, ignore such distributional considerations. To do otherwise would drag the analysis into a morass it could hardly escape. End quote. Now think about what's going on here. This is a book that's trying to show us the impact that economists have actually had out there in the world. And he's now here to tell us, however, they've been absolved of the need to deal with essentially the downside of the intervention. So we just get the upside, none of the downside. Reading this, it occurred to me that most economists reading this would just accept this as a matter of course. They would not stop to think about what is being argued here. But what's being argued here is that the lives of those we destroy through economic interventions that economists have reason to value, we are not going to attend much to the question, can they be compensated? Should they be compensated? If compensation does not happen, can we still say the policy is a good thing? All of this is elided. I would say it's repressed. It's swept under the rug. Now, I my little joke at the bottom is, imagine a book where someone writes on military conquest, a book like Better Living Through Military Conquest. Imagine such a book, because presumably some people do benefit from military conquest, but imagine a book on military conquest that also allows its authors to sidestep the question of who is harmed and what they are due. This makes me a little crazy. And so when I think about the motivation for my book, it was trying to really come to terms with, and I'll stop the share now. It was my attempt to come to terms with what is so wrong in my profession about the way we deal with the harms with which we are complicit. I will stop talking there because that's what I was asked to talk about, the motivation, but I'm so happy to, the quote from Adam Smith, Adam Smith says, look, if you write something, you should be concerned to get one good reader. And when I was thinking about coming to the session and the fact that people of your caliber, who I so deeply respect, have paid me the respect of reading my book, I just have to say, I cannot thank you enough for having given my words your attention. I am in your debt. And now I'll stop speaking.
Thanks, George. That was perfect. I think it really set the scene and makes me think of a couple of members of the Liberal Party in this country arguing that colonization on the whole has been a good thing for Aboriginal people. So there are people out there making that argument about better living through military conquest. Yeah. So now we're at the pointy part here where we need to quickly determine who's going to speak and in what order.
I'm thinking you should go first, Stephen, because you've prepared something.
All right, I will do that. And
I haven't.
yeah. And I'm going to just time myself just to make sure that I stick to time. Just give me a second here to call up my thing. So again, apologies in advance. So my interest in George's book, The Tragic Science, How Economists Cause Harm, stems from some work that Abby Melick-Lopez and I described yesterday in our wasted research event that we're involved in a project that's linking organic waste to regenerative farming. And in his book, we find this harm-centric, humbler version of economics is a strong rationale for an approach that takes a local, small, and experimental approach to designing more circular and reparative economies. So, at least from my perspective, The Tragic Science follows on from George's earlier book, The Economist Oath, where he points out, writing in the wake of the global financial crisis, that economists, unlike journalists, physicians, or lawyers, don't have a professional code of ethics. And at the center of this ethical vacuity is the concept of harm. So let me just summarize my take on that. One, in the first instance, harm is seen as unavoidable, George argues, where every omelet requires to crack some eggs. Second, are instances where harm is trivialized, where any harm, any diminished preference can be compensated for, what George just talked about. And three, the economist's job, therefore, is then to use instruments, most notably cost-benefit analysis, to adjudicate between harms and pick best outcomes. So now to read all three of those propositions together, economists become the arbiters of harm, but never its source. There's no harm that cannot be fixed, and there's no way of avoiding harm. And all three of them together amount to a tremendous hall pass to just simply sin prolifically and then beg forgiveness, something familiar to us Catholics. So the main point with this view on harm, main problem with this view on harm is the condition DeMartino calls irreparable ignorance, a condition where we don't know and can never know the consequences of our actions and the damaging consequences that come with the conceit of acting like we do. On a planet-wide basis, we can see the consequences of consistently prioritizing economic growth while externalizing ecological costs, trivializing harm. So, you know, this is the year where we've seen Canada on fire. And for those of us who live in Australia, it reminds us of the year that Australia was on fire just a few short years ago. 2023 has already been established as the hottest on record. And we're irreparably ignorant about this situation because it has no analog. So Jeff Goodell's book that's just out this year, The Heat Will Kill You First, describes how heat has been a driving force in the evolution of our species as endothermic organisms that maintain a stable temperature internally. And the problem is that it doesn't actually have to get a whole lot hotter than it presently is for our species to be operating outside of our tolerance zone. So that's the sort of catastrophic situation that we're in. This is the new context, the deep uncertainty in which we make decisions around how we invest in and maintain infrastructures for a shared future. So George points out that the statutory authority responsible for managing the Colorado rivers have embraced decision-making under deep uncertainty developed by the Rand Corporation as an alternative to simple cost-benefit analysis, as a way of thinking with those affected about what kinds of futures to plan for. So here we might note a parallel between the Rand approach and Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis development as a basis for commons governance. Central to deep uncertainty both of them involve the people who are affected by decisions in the process of designing how to respond. So central to deep uncertainty is a shift in perspective away from the delusion that the world is knowable and predictable to one where immediate circumstances and actions are to be brought into alignment with shared values. The question George asks is, what can we do today to shape a future to our liking? And here I'd suggest three things. One, that businesses and initiatives that are purpose-driven, and I'm thinking here of the solidarity economy, and rooted in practices of cooperation, stand a far better chance for aligning value and practice. So there's sort of a strong endorsement of the cooperative form. Two, that local scale and in vivo experimentation provides a way of moving towards futures of our liking, one in which we survive while minimizing the chance for egregious harm. And three, this doesn't mean foregoing larger scale transformative action, but the theory of change is then predicated on the sharing of information, trial, and iteration. So it's not just commons, but also a parallel with design that's, I think, emerging here as an alternative. So I see George's injunction here as something not unlike the feminist one, which is to start where we are as a basis for crafting more livable futures. All right, so I'm left with, I've gone over by 30 seconds, but indulge me for one more minute here. Two questions. One, Kalan and Kalaskin have just recently published the third in their series of essays on economization, and it explicitly focuses on the role of design in economization. And one of the things they point out is that decision-making under deep uncertainty has been influenced by design as a discipline. What would it mean to acknowledge that more explicitly? And what role can design play in economics different than the one that it presently does? And second, I just wanted to point out another book that's just come out this year, Renata Solekal's Passion for Ignorance. And in that book, she makes an argument drawing on psychoanalytic theory to say that ignorance and ignoring, as in the verb to ignore, are kind of related, and that in a world where we're saturated by information and opinion continuously, ignorance becomes kind of unavoidable, but it's also the context in which people either engage in denialism, the disavowal of the severity of a problem, witness climate denialism, or kind of conspiracy theories that claim to a pretense of mastery, but are rooted in a kind of delusional ignorance. So I guess the question then is, what's the relationship between ignorance and desire? And how does that change the way that we might think about moving beyond ignorance or acknowledging it or incorporating it into our planning, politics, and ethics? So that's it. Sorry to take an extra minute, but anyways, rather than respond, I think we should just collect all the comments and then go from there. So who'd like to go next?
Not me.
Not Kath. That does leave you, Douglas. Yes, please. Be sure to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Thank you. Okay, so sorry, what are we doing now? Are we all kind of contributing our thoughts to this, or responding to your comments?
Your thoughts.
Your
My thoughts.
thoughts.
Okay.
Your thoughts.
Yeah. So I mean, I when we first started reading this as part of the CERN network, I think it was March last year. Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that, and I don't have is maybe it's kind of eloquently stated, obviously, I've, as what Stephen provided, but what I got out of it was really just thinking about the role of econogenic harm in thinking about risk, thinking about planning and project risk. And I think what stood out to me is I was thinking about, applicability of some of the ideas and what I'd read, and confessing that I haven't read the whole book, but the parts of the chapters that I have engaged with, particularly in the sections around the stakeholder partnership engagement, as well as the introduction. I just thought about how little, econogenic harm is factored into the risk analysis assessment process in big major planning decisions, and thinking about contextually here in Western Sydney around the Aerotropolis, for example, or all these, big kind of infrastructure investments that are happening. And juxtaposing that against my background working in industry, working as a management consultant for one of the big four consulting firms, and being privy to a lot of these conversations about risk, and that risk being really kind of constrained to the project risk, right? As in, is this project going to be a success as it's been outlined and determined by the financial backers, the government planners, the developers, other institutional, industrial stakeholders. And so some of the things that came to mind was, how do we take this thinking that you've come up with in this book and then really insert it into those critical risk analysis processes that are really, go up front into, the planning processes. And so one of the things that stuck out in particular was in the expert stakeholder partnerships section under the decision-making under deep uncertainty chapter. And, where you're talking about the DMDU model, and, that the visual kind of diagram. And then there was a section about the approach depends on sustained interaction between decision makers and the scientific analysis process. Researchers do not simply pass data on to decision makers, but instead support a deliberation with analysis engagement method. That's from Groves et al. In 2016. Under deliberation with analysis, the parties to a decision deliberate on the objectives and options. Analysts generate decision-relevant information using system models, and the parties to the decision revisit their objectives, options, and problem framing influenced by this quantitative information. So, I mean, I think that kind of went some ways to getting into a little bit of the detail of how I thought some of those ideas might be implemented in practice. But yeah, so I think the overall summary of some of my thoughts were just that the opportunity in these ideas to really reframe what risk is, and how it's talked about, and how it's considered, and who gets to consider what risk is, and incorporating those ideas about econogenic harm as a major component of risk analysis, and obviously what that then means for projects that are green lighted and ultimately implemented.
Doug, that was fantastic. And for those of you who are not from Sydney, he's referring to our attempt at building a third city and second airport, where we've dropped billions in infrastructure right now into an area that has hit 53 degrees centigrade, and we're expecting 500,000 people to live there as well. Thank you very much. With no trees, because that gets in the way of the airport.
Sorry, could I just ask? Can I real quick? Do I have time? I don't want to take up too much, but you just made me think of something. I can come back to it later, but I can jot it down if I need to. But it was just, do you mind if I just quickly add a quick little coda to that? Do we have time for that? Real quickly. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say just on that, specifically because this Aerotropolis, one of the things in particular I'm thinking about in terms of harm and risk is they're building an agribusiness precinct. And all of this agribusiness development is all the framing, all the rhetoric, all the planning is oriented around export markets. And so a real tangible opportunity to consider harm, ecogenic harm, is to look at, well, what does that mean then for local food security or alternative food system possibilities where the entire planning and all of everything is already locked in for an export oriented infrastructure development and supply chain model. So that's, to me, was a very tangible example that Stephen just raised. So sorry, I just wanted to get that in. Thank you.
Thanks for sneaking that in. Now, we also have been joined by colleague Declan Cooch as well, who was part of that reading group. He is probably dealing with a baby as well, so that might account for sort of having to juggle schedules. Now, I don't mean to throw you into the hot seat, Deck, but if you wanted to say something about George's book, Kath is elected to go last. And we haven't given her a birthday gift yet, so you're still on mute, buddy.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and yeah, I'm definitely in some fun baby times at the moment. So I think that's a really perfect segue from Doug to what I've been thinking about most specifically in the energy space, actually. So I'm writing about what we're calling the social license to automate, which is the capitalization of flexibility in the energy sector now with the rise of renewables. So who is paid to be flexible is sort of the new political economic question. And yeah, I mean, the neoliberal orthodoxy says, how do we convert uncertainty into risk? Well, markets do that for us because markets are magic and they can do things that centralized bureaucracy can't do, purely because Hayek said so, basically. So I've found your book really useful for thinking through what it means for us to depart from that in the context not just of energy, but of the things that Doug talked about as well in the food sector. We could think about parallels in the health sector as well. I've done some writing with colleagues on this Medical Research Future Fund, which is not about improving the health of Australians. It's about actually creating new markets for medicines that essentially add an IP layer on existing medicines and maybe have some very, very incremental benefit. So I feel like we're in a very funny place across the economy where that there are lots of these sort of areas where I think we need to really radically depart from the neoliberal orthodoxy. But as you drill down into these sectors of the economy, I see like latent areas of neoliberal thinking still absolutely dominating policymaking. And yeah, that's sort of my general comment that I'm sort of grappling with it at the moment, that your book's been really helpful to think with.
That was a very judicious intervention, and Deck and I, there's a lot of work behind that I think we could come back to. I also want to just point out that Kelly's raised a very interesting conversation for all of us to consider. So question. Kath, did you want to?
Yeah. I'll just make a very brief comment, I guess. But I'll have to apologize for a bit of head fog and haven't really had a chance to get back to the book in a way I would have liked to prepare for the session. So that's why I'm kind of going last. And I just have to try and remember back to our conversations before. But I think this book has been really an important one in terms of the talks I've given recently. But the thing that really stuck with me, I think, George, and I guess I'm always trying to kind of move ahead is this point that you made at the end about the way a harm is done by assuming that we have one economic system. You know, the idea of a monolithic system, which is our kind of critique of capitalocentrism, and the harm that is done by assuming that there's not a diverse economy. So I guess that really inspired me to think differently about what we're doing, and thinking about how we might frame the kind of intervention around building community economies in terms of increasing freedoms, and but also being aware of and putting harms first and making sure that we keep that in mind. But and it seems to me that, you know, even taking the example Doug just gave of that Erythropolis and the agribusiness, I mean, to come up with a kind of a more of a speculative analysis of what it would be to do a diverse food system in Western Sydney instead of that agribusiness expert oriented one. And if we could enroll economists or modelers to try and do that kind of work to show what a community economy food system might do in this region as opposed to the other, it seems like that would be a fantastic kind of intervention, which at the moment within the CERN network, we don't have the skills to do that. We have the kind of conceptual framing to think about it, but not the skills to actually do the kind of potential modeling that could be done. And it raises that question for me of, you know, transformational thinking requires us to be modeling things like decommodified sectors or decommodified land, like we had this discussion yesterday in the commoning and legal plurality discussion. And it was really fascinating. Ethan was talking about new kind of legal framings for land return to Indigenous people and to BIPOC communities in Maine. But how the lawyers involved in those communities, once they talked about some very innovative laws that they could try out, the lawyers said, no, don't try it out on our people. We're the ones that have had all this experimentation already. We need to try this out with other groups, you know. So even within that kind of experimentation where we're trying to think about doing things differently, there has to be that question of who's bearing the harm if it doesn't work. And it's something that I think we haven't really thought a lot about. But if we were to try and escalate our community economies work to a kind of a regional scale intervention, it's something that we would really need to kind of workshop, I think. So I feel like your book's given us so many new kind of angles to be thinking about here, you know. And just lastly, you know, with this whole support from the UN for the social and solidarity economy, no one seems to be, you know, mentioning, well, what might be harms associated with that too? Like, and do we bring this harm-centric thinking into this more progressive side of economics? And how would we do that in a way that kind of advances the agenda and the transformative agenda and so on? Because to some extent, you know, we are, as Ethan said yesterday, we're all making these, we're doing all this on a Titanic that's sinking. So all these kind of laws and models and everything that we're working with are things that aren't going to be relevant in 15 years' time, probably, but no one's really accepting that fact. And so we're kind of, in some senses, we do have to be very bold about trying to think about new strategies here and new economic framings. At the same time, we want to be careful that those people who have been most harmed in the past aren't again at the front line of being harmed in these experiments. So I don't know, that's where your book's kind of left me, and I just feel like we're on the cusp of doing some really great work together, and it would be wonderful to think about how we move that forward. But yeah, that's my contribution. Thank you.
That was marvelous. And Kath, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the question that Kelly posed, but it pretty much aligns with what you've just said. So what she wrote was, I'm interested in hearing more from this group about whether there are harms that could emerge from our community economies and diverse economies thinking, and from George about how we might make space for that. For example, I've had recent opportunities to speak into government long-term economic planning, well-being budgets, etc., and it terrifies me. And she also wants to know if you're doing an audio version. And yeah, I listen to everything now, so I'd love that. And sorry, Kelly, you could have just read your question. Sorry about that, but the
Well,
resonance.
also that's because George has a nice voice.
Yeah, actually, yeah, as narrated by the author. That's right. That would be lovely.
I've never been accused of having a nice voice. My poor students, I get screechy when I get excited. So thank you, Kelly, for that. I don't know how to do an audio version. No one's approached me about it. Of course, I'd love to do something like that, but I have no idea if that's in the cards. Stephen, can I jump in? Is this my turn to speak? Okay, I'm really bad at fielding questions, especially many interventions all at once, processing them, and then having the right thing to say. So I'm going to apologize already for not being able to speak in a useful way about some of what you have all raised. But of course, what you have all raised has provoked all kinds of thoughts in my head, and that's where so I'm going to start speaking, and I hope to touch on a whole bunch of ideas that have come across. One reason why this conversation could not be better for me, just a personal note, is that the last time I sat down to write anything was the middle of June. And so I've gone July, August, September, October, almost 4 or 5 months now without writing anything, which is really strange for me because I almost always have the next thing lined up. I'm sure that's true of all of you on the screen. You finish one thing, you already know where you're going next. And I decided to take a pause to figure out how I want to spend let's say the next 5 years. I'm like Lenin, I've got these 5-year plans, and here we are in November, and I haven't sorted that out. But I've been thinking more and more about this group and the work that you all do, and wondering, especially because I got some nice feedback from folks in this group, whether there's something I can do to contribute in a much more direct way to the work of people in CERN. So over the next couple of days, weeks, I'll be thinking about our interactions and thinking about what that might look like. And I might reach out to some of you, or you should reach out to me if you think that there's something I might be able to do to contribute to the project. Now, to get to some of what has been provoked here. First, I want to talk about DMDU. DMDU is not meant by me to, I don't mean to suggest by reference to the DMDU little case study in the book that those people have got it all figured out. First of all, the approach is not appropriate in many, many circumstances. Second, they're stumbling in the dark, trying to figure out how to engage ethically in a world that they realize cannot be known and cannot be controlled. When I found this community a few years ago, I felt like it was the first time in my life as around, let's say, mainstream economists, that I actually had people I could relate to and talk about the epistemic problem, and I didn't have to defend the argument. These people were way ahead of me in thinking about the epistemic problem, and then taking the next step to asking what could be done, how to comport ourselves ethically, given the irresolvable epistemic problem. I offer DMDU as just one approach that people are trying to figure out, building the plane as they fly, to see about how to intervene. But what I love about DMDU are the principles. The principle that we cannot know, we cannot control. We should give up on the conceit that we can do long-term planning, resilience, that we can do long-term cost-benefit analysis, long-term economic impact analysis. I'm going to come back to the idea that we really cannot do that in just a minute. We cannot do that. So doing it, if you know you can't do it, doing it really is professional malpractice. And I want to suggest to you that my profession is guilty of professional malpractice because we're doing something and selling something to society that really we cannot do. So these people were all over that, and then asking themselves, then what does this imply about about how we can facilitate good processing making procedures in the context of empowering, and this is the key, empowering those who stand to be benefited and hurt by whatever policy is taken, empowering them to be centrally involved in decisions about what risks are worth taking in pursuit of what social values. Now, that could not be more fundamentally different from the standard moral geometry I describe in the book, where economists know what it is we should be pursuing. Economists know what's in the best interest of others, and economists therefore feel the ethical right, but also the ethical obligation to impose on society what's in society's best interest. It's straight 19th century 20th century paternalism, unreconstructed paternalism that is thankfully being given up in other professions. We hang on to it in this notion that we know best, therefore we're licensed and authorized to decide for others. DMDU rejects all of that. Now, there are a million ways to go about thinking about interventions in the world if, in fact, you give up on the hubris of control, the hubris of paternalism, and if you really believe that you are not society's harm accountant. The people who stand to be harmed should be the ones meaningfully engaged in what harms to risk. What meaningfully engaged in what are harms, how bad are the harms, and which harms should be risked for the benefit of others. One of the key points that has really been driven home to me over the years in work by people like Nassim Taleb and others is that we went off the rails in economics when we separated ourselves from society. We thought our intervention should be arm length. That's my arm, that's my length, arm length rather than intimate. And that we should make our objective judgments, pass on our recommendations, and try to influence society in that way. What that approach lacks is skin in the game. That is to say, no economist that you can ever imagine that you have ever heard of has ever been held accountable for anything that that economist has done. We are completely insulated, both intellectually, professionally, and in every other way from the consequences of our interventions. When you think about the kind of hybrid research, I forget the term, I'm so sorry, Kath, and the rest of you who do this, hybrid research communities that the CERN project, that the Community Economies project enables, it involves putting those on this screen into situations of ongoing experimentation. And I want to talk about experimentation in a minute. Ongoing experimentation where the researcher has skin in the game, where this researcher doesn't fly in, dictate, advise, and fly out, but instead makes an investment into a community that's actually trying to do something like building a community garden or building a worker-owned enterprise or whatever the project may be. Skin in the game, I've come to think, is one of the critical moral obligations of professionals, not only, but especially in the context where others can be harmed and where we just do not know and cannot control the outcomes of our interventions. All right, I said there's a couple of things I want to come back to. One is experimentation. There is a wave of excitement in economics these days in the area of experimentation. The idea is that we experiment on people to decide what's in their best interest. This is the randomized controlled trials phase that's going through economics. And it doesn't need to be said to this group, but I end up having to express this a lot when I give talks these days. There is a fundamental difference, a world of difference between experimenting on people and experimenting with people, or with communities, with people. Part of the CERN mission is to, again, this goes back to skin in the game, ideally involves experimenting with, not experimenting on. And that speaks to Kelly's concern about, is there something that's potentially harmful in the project? And if so, what does that imply for the ethical obligations? I want to suggest to you that yes, of course, there's immense harm inherent in any project of social reimagining, any project of building, critique and building. There's always the risk of harm. But that then calls forth the need for all kinds of things that for me, and so by the way, I'm not pandering to your community here today. These are the things, it was the knowledge of this work that has been in my head since I first read Gibson Graham, and I still teach, as you saw earlier, that has gotten me thinking these thoughts. So it's so great for me to have a chance to talk about it here. This risk of harm is being managed, it has the potential of being managed ethically when you create communities that embed the scholar, in a research community that's actually looking to build, where the scholar pays the price too, emotionally and perhaps in other ways, but certainly emotionally, for project failures. But where the role of the academic or the expert is to empower communities to make the decisions that I talked about a little while ago. What is harm? What harms are worth risking on behalf of what others? Next point I want to make. I talked earlier about professional malpractice. I want to, I give this talk now. I talk about my book in my last book to lots of groups of professional economists. So not so long ago, I was speaking to financial regulators for the government of the UK financial regulators. And after I give these talks, well, first of all, there's a self-selection problem. The people who are inclined to agree with me are the ones who come, so I don't get to talk to the people who are hostile to what I have to say. But after I give these talks, I invariably get emails, and this is just one example, but it happens all the time, in which people will tell me, professional economists, that they are doing work all the time that they themselves don't believe in. This was a constant response to my previous book in 2010 or 2011, when I talked to groups of economists. We have an entire profession that goes out to work every day, generates this moral geometry, mostly cost-benefit analysis, social welfare function analysis, and the like, a whole profession that does it, that doesn't believe in it. And yet they show up to work every day, they do the best they can, and they try to live with themselves doing work that they themselves would not bet a nickel on in terms of its value or its accuracy. That's why I call this professional malpractice. We have, and this relates to Stephen's point about how we have no professional ethics in economics. The economist who finds herself in a situation where she is being asked to do work that she herself cannot believe in because the time constraints, because she's being asked to price something like human life that she doesn't believe can be human priced and the like, has no place to go in our profession for support to say, no, I won't take on this project. Now, lawyers have that. Doctors have that. Social workers have that. Journalists. If you go through major professions, all these other professions have something behind them, their profession behind them, to say, I will not do that because it violates my ethical pledge to my profession and our profession's ethical norms. And so we have a situation where economists are constantly having to make these extraordinary professional compromises without any help from anyone in their workplace or even in their profession. This is a disaster. But what's so striking to me is how often economists tell me that they're doing work that they themselves don't believe in. Now I want to just quickly go back to some of the comments. And Stephen, I'm not going to talk much longer because there may be some back and forth. We have to be so careful not to impose further risks on the communities that have already suffered risks. Several of you made this point, and the answer is, of course, yes. One way to do that is by empowering these communities, but that's not enough. If you empower a community that's at risk to make their own decisions, they will often be forced to make decisions that are essential to their short-term survival, but don't allow their long-term expansion of human freedoms, because they're living too close to the margin where getting it wrong can threaten, and I don't mean threaten in some metaphorical sense, I mean can threaten their actual lives. So beyond empowering them to make their own decisions, the economics profession has spent too much time doing cost-benefit analysis, figuring out what the optimal policies are and pushing off the costs. Well, what we should have been thinking is, what will make vulnerable communities more resilient in the face of unpredictable risks and hardships, so that that community is in a better place to take risks that they have reason to value. If we're not building resilience in these communities, then we are essentially then saying, well, let them make their own decisions, is just offloading our responsibility, because they will see themselves as being forced to make decisions that are perhaps, quote unquote, too conservative for their long-term interests, because they're too close they're too close to the margin, and there's no room for error in those kinds of cases. Let me see if I just want to, I'm just quickly pushing through here. I think I'm about to stop talking. I don't know this book on passion for ignorance, but boy, am I interested in learning about it. So thank you. I think it was Stephen who shared that with me. Oh, well, Wendell Berry. Now, I don't know this, so I'm going to ask this of the group. When Stephen started us off talking about local, small, experimental approach, of course, my mind went straight to Wendell Berry. And I wonder to what degree Wendell Berry has been an inspiration for people doing community economies and sustainable economies and people in the CERN network. Wendell Berry has a wonderful book called The Way of Ignorance. And I read this book a long time ago. It's really a long essay, and I need to go back to it every so often. I need to remind myself. Wendell Berry argues that we are, my term, irreparably ignorant. We will forever be irreparably ignorant. Moreover, if you think about the domain of what we know, and then think about the domain of what we don't know, what we know is finite, what we don't know is infinite. You take the ratio, we know 0% of what there is to know in the world. Wendell Berry's solution to this is not to overcome ignorance. Wendell Berry's solution to this, it's not a solution, Wendell Berry's thinking about this is that we need to embrace this condition of being a human thinker in the world, and then ask ourselves, how do we live ethically in the context of this epistemic, the fact that we live in a world of what he calls mystery. And in that context, he speaks about some of the very principles, Stephen, that you were mentioning at the very outset, that we should think local, not global, because you're going to get it wrong. Or I shouldn't say you're going to get it wrong. There's no such thing as getting it right. You're going to make interventions that have both benefits, but also damage people. And so far better to do it on a local scale than on a global scale. Point two, pursue strategies that are reversible when you've got the choice, reversible as opposed to irreversible. Because if you pursue a strategy that's irreversible and you find that you couldn't calculate the massive harms that follow, the people you just experimented on are in deep trouble. Whereas reversible strategies, of course, are strategies where you just might be able to pull back and limit the damage that you've done. It's an approach that's all about experimentation, but I'll end with this: experimentation with, never experimentation on those you purport to serve. I'm going to stop there, and apologies if I didn't respond, because I'm sure I didn't, to all the interesting points that you all offered to me.
That was masterful. Thank you. Now, yesterday we had a session that went for exactly an hour, which was probably about half an hour too short. We've got 16 minutes until we're at 1:15. And there's a lot, I think, that has come up. There's some more comments in the chat. Declan wrote something. Who'd like to speak? Perhaps someone who hasn't had a chance.
I didn't help,
Declan,
but
maybe he could talk to that comment too. But sorry, Jen, you want to say something?
I mean, I guess that really crisp expression of experimenting with communities, I think, is a tough challenge, right? It's difficult when you have what feels like a growing and worsening cultural divide that is splitting across education lines when it comes to politics and certainly electoral politics. And I do feel like that is getting worse over time. We're seeing this Labor government in Australia, its primary vote is falling faster than any new government in modern history. And a lot of that is down to rising interest rates and various policies that are seen to be just protecting capital instead of protecting citizens. Just a sort of general point about I guess the kind of multiple scales at which we can think of this, and then interventions with communities being one of the ways we can cut across some of these divides potentially. But yeah, it's a big challenge.
It's enormous. Earlier, Declan, you spoke about pockets of neoliberalism that persist. And of course, that's true. I mean, neoliberalism is going to cast a shadow for perhaps decades to come. What's interesting is that it no longer finds neoliberalism, no longer finds a unified support from the economics profession. Economists have moved, I mean, former neoliberals cannot remember that they were neoliberals at this point, or they're denying. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs now talks about how much, he will every now and then tell us how much he never was a neoliberal, though to watch him in the 80s, that's a hard sell to make. But the point is, for 50 years, 40 years, my profession provided the theoretical backbone for neoliberalism. That's not happening anymore. Kids aren't being trained in the same way as they were. New economists have no interest in neoliberal. Young economists typically have no interest in neoliberalism. They do have interest in doing experiments on people. That's where they are. They're empiricists now, but there's a fundamental change in economics. That speaks to your previous point. As concerns the challenges of experimenting with, this requires new procedures that are so different from the kinds of procedures that agencies that have to make decisions are inclined to implement. I use the example of the Colorado River because the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation for as long as it has existed, has done business the old-fashioned way. Hire economists and hydrologists to do a cost-benefit analysis, make a 100-year projection or a 50-year projection, identify where the marginal social benefit crossed the marginal social cost, identify that as the optimal policy, and advocate for that. That approach, I want to suggest to you that approach is on its deathbed. My guess is it's going to be on its deathbed for decades, but my guess is that that's on its way out. And so the exciting question now is, how do we fill the gap if in fact we starting to see that old way of adjudicating benefits and harms really is being pushed to the side. In this context, you may not think of Joe Biden as saving the world in any meaningful way, but what's so interesting for me is that he has turned his back on neoliberalism. And for example, here he has, since 1981, the US government has been required, every agency that introduces regulations has been required to submit every regulation and rule to a cost-benefit analysis. Because of that rule, it's an executive order, there are thousands of economists in DC that have jobs doing what I call ersatz economics. Biden just released an amendment indicating that cost-benefit analysis would now be demoted. It would be just among one of other kinds of judgments that have got to be made when considering policy. It's a small step, but it's an important step in the right direction, away from this kind of moral geometry that the economics profession has perfected. And again, that's going to open the door to the question, how do we fill the space that used to be filled by cost-benefit analysis? My guess is that's going to open all kinds of opportunities for collaborative, bottom-up, for want of a better word, approaches to policy consideration. That's a hope, as much as a prediction.
So Anna, ever attentive to language, because she's having to think across at least two of them, has made a suggestion around who's experimenting with whom, that I find really quite delightful. And it looks like Kelly's got her hand up. You take yourself off mute, Kelly.
Oh, yeah, no, I was looking at that too. Communities experimenting with economists, which is a nice reframing of that.
Yeah, that's a lovely.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I was just thinking about the Wellbeing Economies Alliance, which I don't know if you've heard of, but it's a global, international, whichever the right word is, organization. And there's New Zealand has a membership in that, and there's a lot of organizations that are part of it. And in their recent conference, they're calling it Economy for Public Good. there were some really good examples of actually consultants developing these kind of well-being metrics where they would, like, for example, a city council had to make a decision between replanting an area with non-native pine forest that was quick growing and they could make money from, or planting it with native forest that would never be cut down but would have benefits for ongoing generations, and indeed across the whole country and perhaps even, you know, the globe. And so these consultants use their well-being analysis to kind of quantify the value in monetary terms of planting it in native forest, but for future generations, the whole country and across the globe. And they presented the two cost benefit analyses to the city council, and the city council said, we'll go with the benefiting everybody. And it was almost like quantifying it enabled them to see their own generosity, their own smartness and cleverness. So I just wonder if you've had any experience with those kinds of quantifications and what some of the harms might come from that, but also some of the things that you're seeing in that area.
Yeah, you know, the book makes an argument against what I call economic moral geometry. Economic moral geometry, as I think of this, is taking complex ethical issues or value conflicts or moral issues, and turning them into simple math problems, then solving the simple math problem and thinking when you've solved the simple math problem that you've also solved the perhaps irresolvable moral issue. I hate it. I hate all forms of moral geometry. The concept comes from a moral philosopher I borrowed from, who's using the same concept to criticize things like utilitarianism, deontological ethics. What do all these give us? They just give us different formula for figuring out what's the uniquely right thing to do. And I think that's what economists do. Now, if I were to look at the index they used, or the mathematics they used to make their judgments, I'd probably like it better than standard cost benefit analysis. But I think that's it's a mistake to substitute one moral geometry for another. I think the issue is because it still puts the economist or whoever is doing this kind of work in the position of being our harm accountants. And it still then authorizes a city council to take an action based on the judgment of the harm accountants, the professionals, who have no skin in the game and who are going to get it wrong anyways. You know, to do that kind of calculation, Kelly, that you just talked about means putting some monetary value on, I don't know, biodiversity in the year 2072 or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, where's the geometry for doing that? It is so, no, don't get me started on this. I think that's, I get a little sad when I see people just trying to build out better moral geometries rather than attacking the very idea of moral geometry. If it gave your city council cover in this one case to do the right thing, okay, I get it. But I guarantee you moral geometry will give other city councils moral cover to do absolutely the wrong thing.
The wrong thing, yeah.
And the people who do these things don't believe in them anyways. I mean, it's just
well, that's what I was going to say. There's sort of it's sort of cynical, right? Like, we know what the right thing to do is, but we're kind of using a cynical way to just play with the numbers. And
you know, when we saw this a lot, we saw this a lot in the first 2 or 3 months of COVID. Suddenly all these cost benefit economists were shooting out rapid cost. You know, keep in mind what we did not know in the first 2 months of COVID. Shooting out these cost benefit analyses purporting to show that yes, in fact, social isolation policies were going to, the benefits would exceed the costs, because that's the result they wanted. And sure enough, you can, once you know the result you want, you can arrange things so that you get that result. Is anybody persuaded by this? No, no one's persuaded. Just the people who already believed you now think that they've got a number. It's such a cynical game. I'm glad you used that word.
Thanks.
Catherine was just going to make a comment about imagining entire institutions organized around cynicism on that scale. There's a few that come to mind. So.
Oh, they already are, though, aren't they?
They all learned it from the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, there's just, you know, there's so many things are coming up in this conversation that feel really, really immediate and relevant to me at the moment in my work. And one of those things is I'm currently doing a project with the local Shire authority, the local government authority here where I live, which I took on because it was totally about the skin in the game. It's like, at last, I've got the chance to do some work that I'm directly implicated in and invested in. And this is what I want to do. You know, I'm risking a lot to do it because I'm doing it as a second job. But anyway, and then you kind of encounter this, all the conundrums that come with that, and the conundrums that come with, so the local council wants, you know, I put a community engagement plan in front of them, which was fully intended to be a slow process of thinking with and kind of figuring out some experiments that could be done collaboratively. And then the council's schedule is like, well, no, we want that engagement to be finished by mid-November. So they're giving me 6 weeks to do it. Like, you know, so then you face this thing of, I don't believe in that. And that's, you know, then I'm in this, yes, but that's unethical. And it's that situation where you don't have a code to fall back on and say, no, you can't insist on this because it's unethical and it's bad practice and I'm not going to do it. So you kind of limp along and try and do it in some kind of a way that you can squeeze things in, do your best, because to not do it at all is also worse. So it's just this awful ethical conundrum. But yeah, I mean, would you like to see economics, for example, develop a code similar to a kind of the code of practice that applies to medical practice? Do you think that would help?
No, not a code, but a whole tradition. We need something much more than that. Lots of professions have codes that nobody pays attention to. For example, political scientists have a code. I've never met a political scientist who even knows. I'm sorry, political scientists in the United States have a code, and I've never met a political scientist who even know it exists. So codes have to codify something. What does it codify? Ideally, a whole tradition that I call professional ethics, a whole tradition of debates and literatures and instruction that grapples with the question, what does it mean to have so much influence in the world, which economists have, and yet have no control in the world? What are our ethical responsibilities? That's what we need, a deep field of professional ethics. Were that to lead then to some codification that an economist could point to and say to the supervisor, I cannot do what you're asking, look at my code, fine. But the code is what comes at the end. What we need is, and this is, by the way, this is what I've been doing my life's work, well, not my life's work. For the last 15 years, I've been trying to do one thing, create a new field that doesn't exist, the field of professional economic ethics. That's where I think the lack is. And Catherine, I want to say one more thing, because economists will sometimes say to me, yeah, we know what we do is bogus, but this is what's expected of us, you know, by city councils. They want a cost benefit analysis. And so they offload the responsibility for the mistake on city councils. And I argue the following. City councils were kids 20 years ago in our economics classes, where we, the suppliers of economic activity, expertise, trained them, our students, in what they should expect from us. They then go off and become decision makers, and they want to hire economists to do exactly what it is we train them to believe we could do: cost benefit analysis, moral geometry. We are responsible for shaping what society wants from economists. So we can't very well, in economics, we can't go blaming people for asking us to do the impossible, because we're the ones that pretended that we have economic time travel machines so that we could tell a city council today what will be the impact 20 years from now of a policy taken today. But of course, there are no economic time travel machines. It's an illusion that we teach our undergraduates, who then go off and ask that from us. I think it's time that we take responsibility in economics and start training our students to know the limits of what it is we can and can't do, so that then as citizens, they stop asking us to do things that we have no business promising them.
Sort of the term that Kelly and colleague Maria Bard was using was the idea of the limits of authority, and how in land-based ethics that becomes a kind of central idea of where are you speaking from and where's your place to stand. Seems like you've just articulated yours. And with perfect timing, we've got 1 minute left to go. I might just take this opportunity to thank everybody who came along. Really productive and far too short of a session, A. And B, I also would like to just extend my gratitude to the Liviana organizers, Anna among them, Priya, and some others who've put in a lot of hours to make this happen. This is the 4th time we've had this Liviana conference. It's really a remarkable thing to have a coordinated global conversation for 2 weeks straight. And I don't know too many other groups that can do that. So thank you, Anna. And we have a record of this as well, so we can go back to it. Yeah, so we might draw things to a close then. And
May I just say
happy
thank you?
evenings.
A deep and sincere thanks. It's so lovely seeing old friends and meeting new folks, but I really am so deeply appreciative of the respect you've shown me by engaging the book. I can't tell you how much that means to me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we'll have
Thanks,
to
George.
chat with Malia and Yaya, Zoe about putting something in RM, maybe some kind of symposium would be in order.
That would be lovely. And a request, I don't know if I'm going to lose this chat in a minute. Some of you have recommended people I should know about. If you could just send me a quick email, that would be really helpful.
I pasted the chat onto an email that I was going to send to Stephen. So
Thank you, Anna.
And well, let's keep going with this discussion about how what you've been doing and what CERN's doing could come together in another iteration somewhere along the line. So
I would,
Yeah.
Kathy, I would love that. I really would.
Yeah.
In-person
Right.
international